If carbohydrates increase the blood sugar, perhaps it's a good idea not to take carbohydrates because then you won't raise your blood sugar. And that's so obvious, we tend to overlook it because mistakenly carbohydrates are seen as a staple of our diet. And some people, unfortunately, still feel that carbohydrates are fundamental to providing energy for our body. And if you don't eat carbohydrates, you won't have any energy. And of course, that's completely wrong. The amount of carbohydrates we need to sustain life is zero because our body produces the carbohydrates or the sugars that we need in-house. Insulin is what's called a fat storage hormone, and in type 2 diabetes people can produce too much insulin, and that tends to make them larger. And type 2 diabetes should really be called a metabolic disease of carbohydrate intolerance. So the carbohydrates, the starchy foods, the sugary foods, people with type 2 diabetes can't handle them as efficiently as people without, and that raises the insulin levels typically, but also it means that insulin doesn't work very well. So they become what's called insulin resistant.
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm Matthew. If you're new around here, I like to talk health and well-being every week. If those are subjects that are of interest to you, you're in the right place. And if you're already familiar with this podcast series, show your support. Like, subscribe, and tell other people who you think might get benefit from these episodes too. We're also on YouTube. If you want to scoot over there and click that subscribe button, you'll join the already over 2,800 subscribers who have subscribed to the channel to date. We're steamrolling our way towards 3,000 YouTube subscribers, and perhaps you can help me get there. Now, today I speak with Dr. Ian Lake. He's a doctor with a professional and a personal interest in diabetes, given he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes over a decade ago himself. He tells me why he adopted a low-carbohydrate diet and the benefits it brings for managing his condition. We hear why insulin is probably a more significant metric or marker than glucose is. We discuss how insulin actually blocks the burning of fat. We also hear what foods you should be consuming to avoid becoming a diabetic patient and how you can reverse prediabetes and type 2 diabetes simply from changing your diet, and lots more besides. Well, Dr. Ian Lake, you are a general practitioner, a medical doctor, a primary care physician with more than a professional interest in diabetes because you have type 1 diabetes yourself. When were you diagnosed with this?
I was diagnosed later in life, age 36. That was 30 years ago nearly now. And it was a classic presentation of raging thirst and passing a lot of urine and being tired, losing a bit of weight. So I was diagnosed as something called a LADA, which is a latent autoimmune diabetes adulthood. So it has the same autoimmunity as a younger person who are typically thought of as the classic type 1. But about a third of people have LADA, which is a form of type 1.
Now, for those who aren't familiar, could you tell us the difference between type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and I recently found out there's a type 1.5 diabetes too?
Yeah, 1.5 is called LADA, really, which is the one I have. There are several different types of diabetes, which is unfortunate, really, with the terminology. So type 1 diabetes is a condition of a lack of a single hormone called insulin. So people with type 1 diabetes cannot produce the hormone insulin at all. So we have to replace it by injecting it into the skin. There's no other route at the moment. There will be a nasal route at some point in the next 10 years. But whether you're using pens or a pump or a hybrid loop, the insulin still has to go into the skin. So that's type 1 diabetes. It's a lack of insulin. And type 2 diabetes is more of what we should really be called a metabolic disease of carbohydrate intolerance. So the carbohydrates, the starchy foods, the sugary foods, people with type 2 diabetes can't handle them as efficiently as people without. And that raises the insulin levels typically, but also it means that insulin doesn't work very well. So they become what's called insulin resistant. So over probably 5 to 10 years of developing insulin resistance, eventually that insulin doesn't work very effectively. So when people eat carbohydrates or sugars, that spills over into their bloodstream and into their urine. and then it's called diabetes, which is obviously started off as sugar in the urine. So type 1 and type 2 are totally different conditions. There are others. There's type 3C, which is based around an inflammation of the pancreas. So the pancreas is a digestive gland as well. It produces digestive juices. And if that becomes inflamed, it can knock out the ability of that pancreas, which is where insulin's produced. It can knock out the ability of the pancreas to produce insulin as well. That's relatively rare, but it's probably more common than we think, and we're not really testing for it at the moment. Those people typically present with type 2, but end up requiring insulin relatively quickly.
Is it a case that with a later in life diagnosis of diabetes, say you're told that you're a type 2 diabetic as an adult, could that have been misdiagnosed? Could you in fact have been a type 1 diabetic for years prior without knowing?
It's quite difficult for us to tease out the type of diabetes on the initial presentation. Often people who are underweight or are more likely to have type 1 because insulin is what's called a fat storage hormone. And in type 2 diabetes, people can produce too much insulin, and that tends to make them larger. That's a rough and ready diagnosis, really, and we need to do blood tests which aren't freely accessible to us. We need to measure insulin levels in the bloodstream, or we need to measure byproducts of fat burning, which are ketones in the urine, in order to help us with the diagnosis. And also, of course, if we suspect an autoimmune condition, we need to be able to measure autoimmunity as well. So on an initial presentation where someone just has a high blood sugar, we need to work out, why has this person got a high blood sugar? Is it due to medication that they're taking? Is it due to a lifestyle? Or is it due to a disease process which is removing their ability to bring down their blood sugar? Of course, insulin's job is to bring down blood sugar. So if you haven't got any insulin, your blood sugar goes up. But if you've got a lot of insulin, it's not very effective. Your blood sugar goes up as well. So teasing out type 1 and type 2 diabetes at diagnosis requires time and effort. But within a few weeks, people should have an accurate diagnosis. There are also situations where people with type 2 lose pancreatic function over time. And of course, they will end up with a type 1 type of diabetes, or an insulin requiring diabetes. So some people with type 2 need to go on insulin. I would say the majority don't, but then as people's control gets worse and worse, it's probably more to do with the lifestyle and their metabolism rather than the fact they're lacking insulin. So a lot of people go on insulin, but they still have high natural insulin levels in their body. But you can develop type 1 diabetes, you can develop insulin-dependent diabetes, even if you're type 2. And if you're a type 1, because we tend to inject more insulin than our body needs, you can also develop characteristics of type 2 diabetes as a result of the treatment for type 1 diabetes.
Now, let's go back to when you were first diagnosed with the type 1 diabetes. You, at that point, decided to adopt a ketogenic diet whereby you drastically reduced the amount of carbohydrates in your diet. Could you talk to me about why you chose to do this and then what the benefits to you are from a health point of view?
Yeah, so thank you. So right at the start, I wasn't aware that there was an alternative to the current guideline management, which is to count the carbohydrates in your diet. And typically, the recommended diet is 50% of your energy should come from carbohydrates. And then because carbohydrates drive blood sugar, and because insulin reduces blood sugar, estimate the amount of insulin you need for the amount of carbohydrates that you're taking. And then in the hope that you can catch the rise of blood sugar caused by the carbohydrates with the insulin to bring the blood sugar down. That's conventional management, and that applies whether you're on a low carbohydrate diet, on a ketogenic diet, whatever diet you're on. The fundamental principles of managing type 1 diabetes are to estimate the amount of glucose-raising components of your diet, mostly carbohydrate, but it may surprise some people, may not, that protein also contributes to that, and then estimate and inject the amount of insulin required. Now, that is known to be a very big ask and very difficult, and a lot of people find that very difficult indeed. It tends to lead to swings to blood sugar because it's almost impossible on a daily basis, and 3 meals a day, whatever people choose to eat. It's almost impossible to get that finesse of control. Obviously, pumps, hybrid loop systems that are coming on will help that process to some degree. But having had 2 to 3 years of worsening control after 20 years of trying to balance my carbohydrates with insulin, I discovered by accident a book by a doctor called Richard Bernstein, and that was very persuasive in telling me that there are alternatives to managing type 1 diabetes. So if you think about it, if carbohydrates increase the blood sugar, perhaps it's a good idea not to take carbohydrates because then you won't raise your blood sugar. And that's so obvious, we tend to overlook it because mistakenly carbohydrates are seen as a staple of our diet. And some people, unfortunately, still feel that carbohydrates are fundamental to providing energy for our body. And if you don't eat carbohydrates, you won't have any energy. And of course, that's completely wrong. The amount of carbohydrates we need to sustain life is zero because our body produces the carbohydrates or the sugars that we need in-house. So, you'll never die of lack of carbohydrates. And it's very fortunate that because the other two components of our diet, the fats and the proteins, they are necessary to eat because they have components that our bodies can't make, but our bodies can make all the carbohydrates that we need. So having read this book, I put it down for a year because I thought, well, that's too much. There's too much fat in that. And I was of the belief at that time that fat in the diet causes heart disease. And again, that is still perpetuated, even though we know now that isn't true at all in the majority of cases. So I decided to go on to the lower carbohydrate diet and do it all, all at once and cut down my carbs from 300 grams a day to 30 grams a day, so 90% reduction in carbs. And from day one, it was apparent that now I wasn't stimulating my body through diet to raise blood sugar. I was getting great control with about half the amount of insulin I needed before. So the number of hypos I was having dramatically reduced. I had much better clarity of thought because my sugar wasn't bouncing all over the place. My vision became clearer. All the aches and pains and palpitations or whatever disappeared within a few weeks. And I knew I was onto something. And so I've stayed on that diet for the last 10 years. So my daily intake of carbohydrates for the last 10 years has been around 30 grams a day, which is a tenth of the recommended amount. And my blood glucose has never been in the diabetic range for the last 10 years.
It really is amazing the impact that just changing your diet, your food, your macros has on your health outcome. It's quite extraordinary. Could you talk to me about that breakdown of your macros, your proteins and your fats? And can we have a look particularly at the fats? Because any discussion about fats will centre on cholesterol. People are very wary of cholesterol. So could you talk to me about what you're ingesting and how much?
People have to read around the cholesterol argument, but years ago it was discovered that there is cholesterol in coronary arteries, which seem to contribute to heart disease, and I think that's not in doubt. But originally it was thought that cholesterol was the cause, dietary cholesterol. But then people realised that your body will make enough cholesterol to make up the shortfall in your diet. So, for example, if you're vegan, you are not getting any cholesterol in your diet at all because cholesterol is associated with animals and animal products. So, for example, humans have a lot of cholesterol, and every single cell of our body has cholesterol in it, and the brain has a disproportionate amount of cholesterol compared with its weight. So, the cholesterol is an active product in the body. And it's thought to facilitate transmission of nerve conduction as well. So animal products contain cholesterol, and of course they also contain fat. So when it was found that cholesterol doesn't seem to cause heart disease, they thought, well, what actually is it the cholesterol's carried in? Well, cholesterol's carried in fat and in animal fats. And so people did studies and felt that saturated fat in particular was associated with heart disease. That's now been shown not to be the case in several major reviews. And I think one of the American charities, and I don't want to quote it because I can't remember which one it was, but they have now withdrawn that stipulation that saturated fat is a risk factor for heart disease. The other thing about, so healthy fats are important. For example, animal fats seem to be okay. Now, we have to temper that a little bit with a person's individual genetics. If you've got a strong family history of heart disease that goes, at a younger age throughout families, it may be that you need to look in more detail about your metabolism with respect to fats. But for the vast majority of people, I think eating healthy fats, so animal fats are fine. Seed oils we tend to discourage because they contain a disproportionate amount of something called omega fats, which are hormonal and anti-inflammatory rather than energy-giving fats. Olive oil is absolutely fine. Coconut oil seems to be fine. And eggs and dairy are equally fine, along with fish and meat. So the idea that meat contains more saturated fat isn't actually true. Humans are about 50% saturated, 50% unsaturated, and most animals are roughly in that category. So say pork is slightly more unsaturated than saturated, I think. Beef is slightly more saturated than unsaturated, but the ratios are around 50-50. So when we're eating fats, which will form a large component of your energy if you're not taking carbohydrates, you need to make sure that the fats are from healthy sources. So cheap, chemically processed, industrially produced vegetable fats can lack nutrients because they're leached out of them in the purification processes, and they can contain an unhealthy balance of certain types of what are called omega or essential fatty acids. So we need to think about eating healthy fats from unprocessed real food sources.
So if you're using this really low carbohydrate diet, this ketogenic approach in order to manage your type 1 diabetes, what is the ratio between proteins and fats then if you're consuming very, very low levels of carbohydrates? Is it proteins, fats 50-50? Is it 60-40?
Yeah, I think people have to find their own way. The more fat you use, the more likely you are to get into deep ketosis. So just let me explain what I mean by that. So if you're not eating carbohydrates, your body will allow fat burning. It's just the way it works. And when you burn fat in your body, the end result of burning fat is something called a ketone body. So it just happens to be called a ketone body. It's a fat remnant. It's left at the end of fat burning, a bit like ash in burning coal or wood, for example. But it's a remnant. But ketone bodies are energy givers, and they're metabolically active, and they can be anti-inflammatory, and they regulate metabolism, and they seem to be favored by neuronal brain tissue. So when you're burning fat, which you will do if you're on very low carbohydrates, there's no other way around it, you'll produce ketone bodies, and they are anti-inflammatory. But the more fat you eat, the more likely you are to produce ketone bodies from what I've just said. Protein is necessary because it's an extremely versatile nutrient, and our bodies are, all of our DNA codes for proteins, basically. So our bodies rely on proteins to fulfill all of the living functions, if you like. So we need to eat a certain amount of protein in order to stay healthy. That amount, the minimum amount, is about 0.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. But you can boost that up, if you're a growing child, that may go up tenfold. So we tend not to restrict protein, but a rough amount of protein is about 1 gram per kilogram of ideal body weight. If you're training, you might need 2, for example, 2 grams per kilogram. The ratio of fat to protein is individual. Some people would have, as you say, 60-40. Some people would go like 70-30 in favor of fats. I think people have to find their own way. And certainly with type 1 diabetes, my ratio, I'd imagine, is about, I haven't tested it for a while. I should have done before this program if I knew he was going to ask me that. But it's around probably 60% fat, 40% protein or something like that, which is a bit high in protein. And protein does put the sugar up, so that may mean you need a little bit more insulin.
Can we talk about the two different ways that are available to us to burn fuel? Most people will be familiar with the burning of glucose as a form of fuel, but they'll be unaware that we can also use fat as a source of fuel. The problem here is that with insulin levels high, this acts as an obstacle. It blocks us using fat as a source of fuel. Can you talk to me about this?
Yeah, so I work on this basis now of insulin optimization. I think the problem with type 1 diabetes is controlling glucose, but actually the problem with type 1 diabetes is the fact that we don't produce insulin. So we have to inject insulin. The problem with the benefit of injecting insulin is it keeps us alive. So there's no doubt about the wonders of this hormone. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But when we inject insulin into the skin, it tends to be at twice the concentration in the body as someone without type 1 diabetes. So we're always in a state of high insulin levels. And what insulin does, when you have high sugar in your blood, insulin is released as the pancreas, the body senses the high blood sugar. It tells insulin to be released. And what insulin then does is get rid of the sugar from the bloodstream. So everyone's bloodstream contains about a teaspoonful of sugar for 5 liters of fluid. So it's a tiny amount of glucose in 5 liters of fluid, which maintains us at 5 millimoles per liter of blood sugar, and multiply by 18 if you go in milligrams per deciliter. So it's 90. So if your blood sugar goes above that level, insulin is secreted by the pancreas and does two main things. If you're exercising, it will move that sugar into the muscle. If you're not exercising, it will move that sugar into the liver, where that sugar is then converted to fat. And then that fat is sprayed around the body in order to be stored for future use. So insulin is a fat storage hormone. It's an anabolic hormone. It's a growth promoting hormone because it also forces amino acids into cells. So insulin is an anabolic growth promoting hormone. So if people have too much insulin in their body, they tend to store fat. And therefore people with type 2 diabetes tend to have too much insulin in their bodies, so they store more fat. And a characteristic of someone with type 2 is someone who's overweight. So insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if you're storing fat, you can't burn it. So if you are asleep at night, so you're not eating, or if you are on a low carbohydrate diet, you do not stimulate your insulin very much. You still need insulin to survive, so you have to inject insulin because insulin is responsible for more than just reducing blood sugar. So it's a critical hormone. But for the insulin we need to control blood sugar, it's such a small level when you're on a low carbohydrate diet that you do not any longer store fat. So low levels of insulin enable your body to burn fat, if you see what I mean. So when you have a low carbohydrate diet, you're burning fat. And when you're burning fat, as I mentioned before, the end result of that fat burning is a chemical called a ketone body. Now, the majority of ketone bodies that we measure in the blood are coming from the liver, because the liver can utilize fatty acids, but it doesn't have the necessary enzymes required to utilize ketone bodies, which every other cell of the body seems to, apart from red blood cells. So those ketone bodies go up to the brain, which can't itself use fatty acids very much for energy. So it's an elegant system where we nourish the brain with products of fat burning, and we nourish the body with products of fat, the rest of the body with products of fat burning as well. So if you have low insulin levels, you can enable your body to produce ketones. So hence the name ketogenic diet when you're on a low carbohydrate intake. For me, the advantages of that are that because I naturally have higher levels of insulin, because I have to inject it into the skin and not into the right place, which it should be coming from the pancreas, I tend to have fat storage metabolism. And therefore, only by cutting carbohydrates can I enable my body to have a fat burning metabolism, if you see what I mean. So type 1s to go on a ketogenic diet enables the body to access glucose, because the body will make its own glucose as needed. It will enable my body to access fatty acids, and it will enable my body to access ketone bodies. So I now have provided my body with a choice of fuels for each individual cell to choose which fuel it wants to use. So when we say the body needs sugar for energy, that is too broad a statement. We need to say individual tissues have different requirements for the types of nutrient they prefer. So we're starting to understand that some immune cells prefer ketones, some immune cells use glucose. Some brain cells prefer ketones over glucose, for example. Hence the spectacular results we're getting with ketogenic diet in lots of brain diseases such as bipolar disease and migraine, possibly also severe depression. So certain tissues of the body require ketones, certain tissues require glucose, and other tissues are quite happy burning fat. So if I'm someone with type 1 diabetes on a high carbohydrate diet, knowing that I'm already injecting more insulin than I technically need, I will be putting my body permanently into a fat storage metabolism. And by putting my body into a fat storage metabolism, I'm forcing my body to burn glucose for energy, knowing that certain tissues of the body prefer other fuels, although they will use glucose if they have to. So I feel that insulin optimization, cutting down your carbs as part of your diet, makes absolute sense because it enables my body to choose what it wants rather than me forcing my body to choose what it has to take. So that's why I call it insulin optimization. The other reason is, of course, that insulin doesn't just act for food. Insulin operates in situations of stress, whether that be mental stress or physical stress. Physical stress can be lack of sleep. Insulin responds to our circadian rhythms. We need to understand the phases of our daily body rhythms where insulin is more likely to be needed. Insulin obviously operates in physical activity. And when I do my physical activity, because of that, I tend to do it fasted. So I don't need, it gives me good blood sugar control because I don't need to worry about my insulin at that point. And of course, lack of sleep stimulates the counter hormones to insulin, which raises blood sugar. So insulin optimization in type 1 diabetes, for me, having researched it quite well now, it seems to make the most sense, which is why part of insulin optimization is a very low carbohydrate ketogenic type of diet.
So if we look at this kind of diet more broadly, if we look at people who aren't diabetic, just people who are trying to lose weight, because you're cutting back on your carbs, you're engaging in insulin optimization, and this then causes you to use your fat as a source of fuel, which then results in you dropping in body weight. Would that be true?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the basis of the low-calorie diet, isn't it? You take in fewer calories than you need, so you're making your body burn fat. But absolutely, I mean, the thing about type 1s is that we can tell non-type 1s how their insulin's working because we have to live with it every day. You know, I can tell you when my blood sugar goes up, that's due to stress, that's due to lack of sleep, and that's how much more insulin I need to counter the sugar rise due to those things. So, yeah, you listen to your type 1s. We can tell you how insulin operates in the body. We'd rather not, but we do. And yes, broadly, a lifestyle where you maximize your lifestyle to reduce your insulin volumes will undoubtedly help you lose weight and also feel more vital. It's the vitality that for me is a thing. It's the mental clarity, the better vision, etc. And when we did a study, I looked at 150 people from my website. I did a survey of 150 people who are keto advocates. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been on my website. But of the people that had mental fogginess, and we all know what mental fogginess is. It's the lull you get after a big meal at lunchtime, basically. You feel a bit you feel a bit knocked off, don't you? A bit tired, a bit less able to think straight. And 50% of people with type 1 diabetes experience mental fogginess, and of those 50%, 75% of those improved enormously when they went on a keto diet. If you think about the implications of that for things like driving, operating machinery, having mental clarity is everything.
Well, we've been talking about blood glucose. Can we go into more detail about the normal ranges people should be looking to stay within if they don't want to acquire prediabetes or diabetes type 2? I ask in particular because I recently got a continuous glucose monitor, which is in the back of my arm at the moment. And now I don't have diabetes myself or prediabetes. I'm just doing this as an exercise out of interest to see the impact different foods have on my own blood glucose levels. So can we speak a little bit about that healthy range of blood glucose that we should be looking to stay with?
Yeah, the healthy range is most people would say 4 to 6 millimoles per litre, which is 72 to 6 times 18. Somebody can work that out. 72 to about 90 odd. That's quoted as the normal range. Some people will push that range up to 7. Some people would drop 4 and go a bit lower than that. 4 for type 1s is probably a sensible floor, certainly with the lifestyle that most type 1s lead, which is a high carbohydrate lifestyle. So at 4, I'll be starting to, even if I didn't feel hypo, I think I'll be correcting that. Children tend to run a little bit lower. Children will run sort of between 3.5 and 5. And of course, we apply to children for control the same level as we apply to adults. So we're probably causing the children to have slightly higher sugars for various reasons. Just out of interest, when I did a 100-mile run over 5 days with no food at all, just water, with another fellow type 1 who was up for it, and 6 other people. And we tried to get as many people as we could to wear continuous glucose meters. But one of the people who wore a continuous glucose meter, who had no type 1 diabetes at all, she had a healthy functioning pancreas. Over that 100 miles with no food at all, she had a glucose of 3 or less for 30% of the time. 54 or less for 30% of the time, and was completely asymptomatic. So there is some evidence that ketone bodies protect against symptoms of hypo. But for practical purposes, I must say that 4 should be the floor for people with type 1 until we get better knowledge that that insulin management is improved. So we need to be thinking about managing insulin, I think, rather than managing glucose. Glucose is a symptom of our condition, to be absolutely brutal about it. It isn't a cause of our condition. So bringing down the glucose is obviously desirable, because we know that high blood glucose is associated with lots of the complications of type 1 diabetes, especially what we call the small vessel disease. So retinopathy, our eyes, our kidneys, and our peripheral nervous system. But the large vessel disease, the strokes, the heart attacks, etc., they probably are more likely to be caused by high insulin level, high sugar levels, although the sugar doesn't help. So I think we should be thinking about insulin rather than thinking about sugar, because if you think about insulin, your sugar will follow. If you think about sugar, your insulin will not necessarily optimize. And a slight concern is that when the hybrid loop systems come out, which are absolutely marvelous, I'd love to have one, but I don't qualify right now on the National Health Service because my control's not bad enough. But you will be getting really good blood sugar control for majority of the time. My slight concern is, does it matter then how much insulin you're using to get that blood sugar control? And I think from what I've said, it does matter. If you're using 10 units, is that good? Do you get a pat on the back for that? What if you're using 1,000 units a day, but you're still getting perfect sugar control? Does that matter? I think it really does matter. And I think we need to start thinking about optimizing insulin rather than optimizing the glucose as a direct target. I think we need to optimize glucose, but if you optimize insulin, you will almost certainly optimize the glucose anyway. So it doesn't matter as much. But if you're on, say, 1,000 units of insulin to get a perfect blood glucose profile, well, what's that insulin going to do? It's going to make your body store fat. So you're going to end up basically with a perfect glucose profile. But eventually that won't be the case because you'll develop insulin resistance, and then you'll develop symptoms of type 2 diabetes, and then you'll have more insulin, you'll put on more weight, and then you'll have all the problems with not controlling your blood sugar. So I think because insulin resistance means you have poor blood sugar control. So us type 1s who are being encouraged to have hybrid loops, and I think they're great, we need to be mindful of the fact that it's not just the sugar that we need to worry about, but the insulin as well. Otherwise, we're going to give ourselves type 2 diabetes.
You've said that glucose is a symptom. It's really the insulin that is the marker that we should be focusing on. Does the same thing apply to HbA1c? Should we be focusing still on insulin rather than HbA1c?
Yeah, A1c is a direct reflection of the average blood sugar, which is why it's not ideal, but it's a good marker. But it doesn't reflect the highs and lows of daily living. So you can have a 20 and you can have a 2. And you can keep going up and up. Your HbA1c average over time will probably be in a good range.
You mentioned diabetic retinopathy, one of the symptoms that comes with having diabetes. Is it possible to reverse these symptoms?
We have got evidence of that. Certainly I reversed my retinopathy briefly, but I've still got 1 or 2 blood vessels, but not much. We have a lot of people with type 2 who seem to be reversing retinopathy. Dr. David Unwin, who's a fellow GP in the UK, has got evidence that renal function improves with a low carbohydrate diet. And Richard Bernstein, who basically written the Bible on low carbohydrate diets in type 1 diabetes, he had quite a lot of complications of type 1 diabetes in his 40s, and he's reversed nearly all of them. So I think normalizing blood sugar and also at the same time reducing insulin volumes, which of course insulin in the long term is pro-inflammatory. In the short term, it probably isn't. So over years and years, you get this inflammatory situation building up. So I think it is possible, but it's difficult to make that claim because they don't want to set up false hope. I think if you get reversal of complications, it's a bonus. I do know people who are keto, they do really, really well, but they've had such entrenched type 1 diabetes, the underlying inflammatory processes in that disease tissue seems to carry on sometimes. But it's in my view, it's better to not keep promoting that pathology. But you have to accept that, sometimes if you've had your eyes lasered and you go keto, and then you may still need more laser because there's some tissues that are so tenuous with their blood supply, they will probably revert to glucose metabolism, which is a more primitive metabolic state, really. And you have to be a little bit more mindful of the fact that, yes, if I get reversal of complications, it's a bonus. Certainly a lot of people will get improved renal function. A lot of people will get less progression of their retinopathy, or it may even reverse if they're lucky. And it seems to be that neural tissue, which we talked about right at the start about mental health, well, neural tissue in peripheral neuropathy tends to increase quite well with a keto type of diet, but it can take 12 to 18 months.
Well, let's park type 1 diabetes for the moment and focus on prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Is it possible to reverse these two conditions through adjusting your diet alone?
Yeah. Why do you get prediabetes? It's probably lifestyle augmented by your genetic profile. So not everyone who's obese is diabetic and never will be. But there are some people who are obese who cannot handle the carbohydrate volumes that we're asked to be eating at the moment. And of course, those carbohydrate volumes that we're asked to eat are not scientifically determined at all. Nobody said, oh, what's the optimum amount of carbohydrates in the diet? Nobody said that. Everyone said, oh my God, fat's going to give you a heart attack, so cut your fat down. Protein, probably we should keep that roughly the same because, that seems to be about right. So what has to go up to make it 100? Carbohydrates. So carbohydrates increased by accident, and it's obviously very lucrative to make cheap food expensive by processing it. But carbohydrates have not entered our diet in the amount we're eating scientifically. So I think that's put a lot of people who would otherwise not be at risk, say 60, 70 years ago when we were eating higher fats in our diets, that's put people into the risk category for developing diabetes, probably because a genetic predisposition has now been, and the diet has overwhelmed their capacity to handle carbohydrates in the non-scientific amount that we're eating right now. So if you have pre-diabetes, just adjusting your diet will take you straight out of the diabetes category into non-diabetic. And I think the range that we choose of 48 millimoles per mole for HbA1c, which is 6.5%, I think that's called remission. We use that for scientific purposes, but I think we should be aiming for 6% or even lower to call it true remission, when I think people are completely out of the woods. But you can get 90% of people with pre-diabetes out of the diabetes range just by diet and lifestyle alone, and you can maintain that without medication for as long as it takes. But clearly, if they lapse back into carb creep, as we call it, and start to eat more carbohydrates again, they may then their vulnerability may play out, and then they may develop pre-diabetes again. If you've had diabetes for type 2 for a long time, it seems to be more difficult to get into remission, because there might be inflammatory processes which have set up, permanent damage to the tissues, and it seems to be more difficult to get those people into full remission. But you do get a marked improvement in their control, which can only be good, because we do know that HbA1c, the long-term measure of control, the higher the HbA1c, the more likely you are to get complications. And there's a terrible statistic that came out of the European Association for the Study of Diabetes in 2020. It was a poster session. I happened to find it somehow. My life's that sad to find a poster session from a international meeting, but it was well worked. It was from some respected sort of researchers in the UK, and they showed that if you have an HbA1c of 7.5% or 58 millimoles per mole, which 70% of people with type 1 diabetes in the UK and certainly England and Wales have. So 70% of our people with type 1 have an HbA1c 58 and above. They lose 100 days of life for every year their HbA1c is at that level. So we have 70% of our population losing 100 days of life every year. And that hasn't altered for several audits now. And that makes me worry that there must be another way of helping that 70% of people. And, that equates to about 8 years of life lost over a lifetime, depending on when you get it. So if you get diabetes age 3, 4, or 5, that has a significant impact on how long you're going to go. And I think when you can get your HbA1c down to normal, which is 95% or more people on a keto diet can easily achieve that, I think that can only be good for your long-term health, which is why I'm an advocate for it and tried to say, well, this is available to you guys. You don't have to keep trying your best with eating a lot of carbohydrates. It's difficult to get the message across. People tend to like sugar. Sugar's an attractive food. You blow your first birthday candles out age 3 and it's associated with happy times. And there may be an addictive component to carbs to make us fat for the winter. So, fat doesn't just store as fat. Fat will store the sunshine from vitamin D in there as well. And of course, when, in the times before we had big supermarkets and we could just go and get what we wanted when we wanted, and if we can't get it from the supermarket, we just fly it over from Peru, the next day. This amazing world we live in right now. But in February in the UK, there is no food to be found anywhere, apart from the odd hare or rabbit or whatever you might find, that you can eat. So our fat then is very useful for us to burn. And in times of plenty, I think our body probably makes us eat more carbohydrates to make us fat, in order that from the winter months we burn that fat off. And of course, burning that fat off will release that locked-in vitamin D from the summer. So it's an amazingly elegant system that we have. So I think, therefore, that the ketogenic diet seems to me to be the best thing we can do for our people with type 1 diabetes, or certainly inform them that it's available, because at the moment we tend to be saying, oh, eat what you like and you can inject insulin to suit. And of course, if you have a slight fondness for carbohydrates, or if you like sweet sugary foods, being told to eat what you like is an amazing thing to do, isn't it? I mean, it's pandering right into your vulnerability. But I think it's leading to these problems where you're losing 100 days of life every year. So you can eat what you like, but you have 100 days to less to eat what you like further down the line. So I think it's better to eat a diet that will improve your day-to-day lifestyle. 6 times fewer hypos. Anyone with type 1 diabetes will realize 6 times fewer hypos is enormously beneficial in day-to-day living. So you don't just improve your day-to-day life, improve mental clarity, decrease joint pains, decrease palpitations, not having to get up at night to pee, et cetera, et cetera. You get all those day-to-day benefits, plus you're probably going to get the long-term benefits. And of course, we won't know that because no studies are being done. But we do know that the so-called proxy markers, the HbA1c, or now we have continuous glucose meters, we have a time in range targets, all of those seem to show with the keto diet that it's beneficial. And we do know that people on keto diets reverse their chronic disease. I mean, there's a guy called Tony Royal, who I think people can find, Royle, Tony Royal. He reversed his heart disease by diet and lifestyle alone, which is remarkable when you think about it. And there's a fellow type 1 called Andrew Kutnick from the USA, who's just produced a paper, but he's been keto for 10 years. And he's just published a paper showing that all of the markers for heart disease have improved over the 10 years compared with if he was on a conventional diet. And that's a study of one, but it does give you some idea. And it's logical to think that if you improve your control every day, you're less likely to get complications.
100%. And it really is a stark statistic that you gave there as far as mortality and those lost days are concerned for people who have diabetes. And it's also encouraging to know that if you adjust your diet, if you change the food you eat, and if you keep an eye on those macros, well, then you can empower yourself and you can take control of your health such that you don't become a victim of diabetes. You mentioned your website earlier. Can you give me more details about that and about how people can get in contact with you should they wish to do?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's kind of you. Well, my website is type1keto.com, type and then the number 1keto.com. From there, I have adverts for a 6-day residential course that I run. It's currently in Bath, but we're trying to expand that into other areas. There's information for healthcare professionals, and you can get in touch with me one-to-one on there as well. And there will also be adverts for single-day events, which I run with fellow type 1s who are also on a keto lifestyle, in which we've got an expert on sport, an expert on recipes, an expert on mental health, an expert on living life with a family, and an expert on what it's like to have complications, because she didn't know any different, if you see what I mean. So that we run day events, about 3 a year. So it's all on my website, type1keto.com. And if you're a healthcare professional, please get in touch with me and arrange to let me come and have a chat with your team.
Well, Dr. Ian Lake, absolute pleasure to talk with you today. We will pop your website in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity. That's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. If you got any benefit from it, please show your support. It's free. Like, subscribe, and share with other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. Reminder, we're also on YouTube as well. If you want to become a subscriber over there, it would be immensely appreciated. Until next time, stay happy.